Hey, everybody. Welcome to part two of Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke. This is a bit of a crash course today. Basically, going to be giving you a summary and some of my thoughts on part two, which is entitled The Golden Age, and part three, which is the last part, which is entitled The Last Generation. So, we're going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to throw a few ideas at you. Hopefully, you agree. If not, let me know. Very interested to see what you have to say about this. So, let's get right into it. Just pull up my notes here. I want to also say this is the fourth time I've read this book, and I have to say, you know, I always have a different experience when I reread a book, and this one was a little bit underwhelming. I remember really enjoying it the last time I read it, and this time around, I had a bit of a different experience, and we'll get into that a little bit. But that goes without saying. It's just that I think it's important to sometimes go back to books that are considered to be literary. I mean, this is definitely considered to be a literary science fiction book or an example of science fiction literature. So when something's considered literature, it's good to really scrutinize it, because that's a pretty big claim. And even though I think it's a great story and I like it, there are certain things that I don't think have aged well with the book, but we'll get into that. So, so yeah, we ended the last video, finally meeting the overlords. I had showed you a picture of what Clarke had based these creatures on, the sort of Dante Alighieri esque Satan, Lucifer, and ingeniously has designed these creatures after a being that has become synonymous with evil incarnate. So, like I said, it's ingenious because throughout the whole first book, first part of this book we're reading, and I don't know about you, but I kept thinking to myself, how bad could these creatures actually be? I mean, how horrifying could they actually be? And the fact that he chose that particular figure to base these creatures on would scare anybody. I mean, religious or non-religious. So I think that was a really, really clever little trick that he used there. But it goes on to say that we have in the book, humanity has gained, or the overlords have earned the trust of humanity, basically because the overlords have given humanity utopia. And utopia is really interesting because everybody's version of utopia is different. And this is why I asked you in the discussion questions to sort of describe your own utopia, because there is no one single utopia. My utopia would be different from anybody's, and yours would be different from anybody's. It's pretty specific. A dystopia, for example, it's very easy for all of us to sort of agree on what a dystopia is, and anything that's quite unpleasant, sort of universal surveillance, or mandatory anything, slavery, we would all agree is a pretty rotten way to spend your life. So dystopia is something that's easy to agree on. And the next book we're going to be talking about, which is George Orwell's 1984, I think we would all pretty much be able to agree that the ideas that he shares in that book and his views on sort of mandatory servitude to Big Brother, we would all highly not want to take part in. And I think that's one of the reasons why dystopic novels have a lot longer shelf life than utopic novels, because they simply are just pain is universal. No one wants to feel pain. No one wants to experience mandatory servitude or anything of that ilk. So that's why those books are the ones that normally, like I said, have a longer shelf life. But for all intents and purposes, this book was written in the early 1950s. So we are looking at an example of utopia, mid 20th century utopia. What Clarke finds to be ideal would probably be what most people found to be ideal at that point in time. So we're in the golden age, which is the second part of the book. Everything seems perfect, and everyone can pretty much do whatever they want, wherever they want, whenever they want. Crime has been all but abolished. Education has become a sort of lifelong pursuit that anybody can take part in. You basically can be anything you want. If you want to be an astronaut, you can study to be an astronaut. If you want to be a race car driver, you can be. I mean, it's basically everybody has free reign to do whatever they want. This sounds kind of great at first. Of course, people are going to get bored of this. That's the other thing that sort of comes with a utopia. People are always going to get bored, right? So that's something that we'll talk about a little bit later on. But the world is basically at this point a sort of interactive playground. And we get an example of this with this, ultra bougie soiree that a gentleman named Rupert Boyce is having at his home. Rupert is a sort of minor character, but he's important because he basically brings some of the major characters in the book together at this specific party. And we're also at this point in time introduced to the second overlord. His name is Rishabharak, and Rupert, I think, calls him Rashi as a sort of a pet name. And they have this kind of quid pro quo. Rishabharak wants to study Rupert's library on paranormal investigation, and Rupert has the biggest, most expansive library on the subject. But he basically says, yeah, you can study it, but you have to come here and study it. You can't take the books out of my house. And there just so happens to be this super schwanky party held at the moment that Rishabharak is there, studying the books in the library. So basically, he's being exploited by Rupert, which is why I said there's a kind of quid pro quo there. But he is able to study this literature, and obviously the overlords are crazy smart, and they can read faster than anybody. I think they can read 1 page per second, and I think he's reading like 2 books at a time, so he's getting through the collection pretty quickly. And so during this party, we also meet 3 characters that are extremely important as well. You have Jan Roderick, and you have George and Jean Gregson. And there's a little bit of a conversation between, I think, George and Jan at one point on the balcony. Jan is kind of, looking wistfully up at the stars, and he's this a restless scientist that just wants to know more about the overlords and who they are and why they're here, which becomes also very important. But we go back to the party, and there's a seance being held because, remember, Rupert is fascinated by paranormal activity in literature. So of course there's a seance. They pull a Ouija board out. They all sit around, and Rishabharak is kind of looking over everyone and humoring them by being a part of this seance. But things get a little strange. The board is answering questions more and more accurately. Finally, Jan asks the board, where is the Overlord's son? And the board gives him the exact points at which you would find their son. And then Jean, George's wife, faints. So this is something that that Rishabharak finds intriguing. He goes back to oh God, what is his name? The other overlord, Karelin. He goes back to Karelin and tells him about his findings and what has happened. So this is sort of in the back of our minds as the story progresses. Why this experience happened and what happened. After the seance, the story focuses on Jan. He is sort of hatching a plan in regards to how he wants to sort of satiate his scientific needs. He is an astrophysicist. He's extremely smart, and he becomes increasingly more obsessed with and restless with the sort of secretiveness of the overlords. He doesn't understand why they won't let humans travel to their world, and he doesn't understand why they're not giving us the full picture of why they're here. So he cogitates on this for a time, and he finally, like I said, hatches this plan. And with the help of a friend, he will sneak onto an overlord ship as a stowaway and get the chance to be the first ever and only person to see where these creatures actually come from. And there are more biblical references here, considering that he decides to hide away in this giant taxidermied whale, although it's not a real whale. It's fake, but we'll just say it's taxidermied. He sneaks into it, and it's basically a prop that is being built for a giant museum that the overlords have on their planet of Earth. It's almost like basically just a smaller version of what Earth would look like for them to sort of study after they're finished studying Earth in person, I guess. Anyway, so this is not something to be taken lightly. We have to consider physics here and relativity, and the fact that if he sneaks on this ship, and it may only take 8 months, 6 to 8 months to get to the overlord's world, because the ship is traveling at the speed of light. Jan's only going to age a few months, but the world and the people living on Earth will have aged, or will have aged 80 years. So anybody that he has known in his lifetime will be gone when he comes back home. So this is a sacrifice that he's willing to make, because like I said, he's a scientist through and through, and he wants to be able to have some of these questions answered. And he gets away with it. But throughout all this, we're getting little clues of more and more of why the overlords are actually on Earth and what their true intentions are. It's almost as if they're giving humans everything that we have ever wanted in order to sort of appease us, and enough so that they are left alone to their own work and research. So during this time, Jean and George are married. George has become sort of dissatisfied with his job, and he wants to check out this place called New Athens, which is in the Pacific Ocean. Um, I don't know if New Athens is supposed to be located. He never specifically says where it's located, but I think it could be Hawaii. Um, but it sounds like he's talking about the islands of Hawaii. But anyway, it's in the Pacific. It's very secluded from the rest of the world, and he has there's this special community that has been set up, with a very condensed group of people. And the sort of point of New Athens is to be completely independent from the overlords. They just want to be left alone. So this is kind of an offshoot from the Freedom League from the first part of the book. And it's symbolic for many reasons. I mean, the name itself, New Athens, is very symbolic because it sort of symbolizes the eventual decay of utopian society. It's a great idea. It's nostalgic, but in the end, it's pointless. It's not going to last. It's ephemeral. And they do things, little things like use bicycles and kitchen appliances, things that they don't really have any need for, but they do it because they're sort of purposely inconveniencing themselves in order to kind of simulate or to create a simulation of what life was like prior to the overlords. So for a while, it works, and George and Jean seem to really like it there, but things are still getting a little weird. And also, I just want to point out, and this is, like I said, this is my opinion. You don't have to agree with this. Take it with a grain of salt. But this is one of the main parts of the book where I really don't think it ages. It has aged well because women in particular are not sort of given any what's the word I'm looking for. I mean, the men are the ones in the book that are building this new Athens politically and socially, and they are the ones that are sort of in constantly being intellectually stimulated, where the women are sort of happy with staying home and knitting, literally. I mean, that's one of the things that they do is they knit, and I just found that to be so absurd. But again, we have to look at the time that this was written, and I mean, like I said, Clarke, he had a lot of forethought, and he had a lot he had a great ability to sort of see into the future. However, he was sort of a slave to the time that he was living in. So I found that to be a little silly, the way the women are made to be in the book. But that being said, Jan and George seem to be happy here, but things seem to start to get weird. And it all starts with their son, Jeffrey, who is out playing, and he sees the ocean start to recede. And what's happening is a tsunami is basically taking shape, and he is telepathically told to run. And George knows that the overlords were involved with this, and he knows that the overlords had something to do with Jeffrey's life being saved, but he can't figure out why. He can't understand why. And there are many digressions throughout all this. It's not a straight story. I mean, Clarke, as you can tell, he's really sort of injecting as many ideas as he can into the book. And I think this is a weak point of the novel, because it's a guessing game. I mean, he's thrown so many things at the wall, um, and trying to make these things stick. And being that we are reading this book, 70 plus years after it was written, or about 70 years after it was written, we are sort of living in the time, um, that he's talking about here, and a lot of it just doesn't work. So that's definitely a weak point of the book. Anyway, um, throughout all this, Jeffrey begins having dreams, strange dreams, and his baby sister is causing things like her rattle to float in midair. So we're seeing a bit of telekinesis here, and this obviously goes back to maybe why Rishabrak and Corellin are so interested in paranormal studies, because telepathic abilities and telekinetic abilities obviously play a major role in that field. And the dreams that Jeffrey is having sort of break through into real life. Now, his sister is still an infant, so obviously she's not able to articulate what she's experiencing. But the fact that she's causing things like her rattle to float in midair show that she's experiencing something. And all the children in the world, I think from ages like from infant to like 15 or 16, are experiencing similar things. And Corellin finally reveals why they are there, why the overlords are on Earth, and he basically says they were sent by this higher power known as the Overmind, and they were sent as sort of midwives. And you can look at this again from a religious standpoint if you want to. The Overmind is similar, very similar to what Christians would refer to as the rapture. And the children are the last generation. Eventually, their minds will become one, and they leave the Earth and they join the Overmind. And the planet is destroyed in its wake. So we're seeing allusions to revelations in the Bible as well. And you can take this religious metaphor as far as you want. Clarke leaves a lot of room for interpretation. But the great thing about this is that you don't have to look at this as religious at all. You can look at this in a more rational scientific context. You can look at the Overmind as this sort of alien force, this miasmic cloud, if you will, that literally absorbs worlds and races. Because the overlords say that we aren't the first. I mean, there were like 7 other races of beings that were absorbed by the Overmind before they came to Earth, and they're powerless. The overlords are powerless to this thing, and all they can do is really study the phenomenon, which is terrifying. So in the end, we come back to Jan, obviously, right? He's the only human left. He, by becoming a stowaway on one of the overlords' ships, he was able to sort of bypass this whole thing. He comes back 80 years later and sees the basically what has happened since the children, the last generation, have changed, and they all sort of move in to this community together, and they live on this big tract of land, and they're being kind of telepathically taught how to be, until the Overmind comes and absorbs them. And Jan, because he's a scientist and science is his sort of, that's his bedrock. He decides not to leave the planet when the overlords say it's unsafe to be there anymore. And he stays behind and he vocally records what he is experiencing as the Overmind takes over. And in the end, there's a great flash of lights, and the Earth's core is sucked dry of all its energy, and we're left with Corellin and his shipmates sort of feeling the aftershocks of it all. And Corellin is very saddened by it, because even though we were sort of meant to be studied by the overlords, he's come to take a great liking in human beings, and he's sad to see another race of beings being sucked up by this creature. So that's it. That's Childhood's End. And I feel it is literary in that Arthur C. Clarke does such a good job at making it seem realistic and plausible. Even though it's not, he still does a really good job showing that, if something like this were to happen, it may in fact play out in this exact way. That's just my opinion. I mean, you can disagree with me about that, because like I said, the book did not age well. So I'm curious to see what you thought of the book. Like I said, I enjoyed it the first couple times I read it, but this time around I wasn't quite impressed by it. So I'm really curious to see what you all have to say about it. And that's it. That's Childhood's End. The next book, like I said, is 1984 by George Orwell, and with 1984, the reason I put these two back to back is because we are kind of seeing, one ingenious writer's take on utopia and another ingenious writer's take on a dystopia. And 1984 is another book that I've read quite a few times, and it never ceases to not scare me. So, if you've already read it, I really encourage you to read it again, because I think with a book like 1984, we tend to find new things every time we read it. If you haven't read it, buckle up, because it's a pretty intense ride. So that's all I have for today. Please have your discussion questions done by tomorrow, Friday. And next week we have a quiz and a paper, which I'll have up on Monday. And then we will begin 1984. So have a great weekend, and I hope everybody's doing well. And I will talk to you soon.